thank you guys so much for coming. I really am grateful for all the faces, and thank you to Nikki for that introduction, and to Nancy Gross for her supreme graciousness in organizing this, and John Fenn, head of programs, and the rest of the awesome staff at the Folklife Center. I'm really honored to be asked to deliver a Botkin Lecture, and really honored. I'm just very grateful. And as Nikki said, I'm going to be talking today about I'm going to start my timer so I know, the occupational culture and folklore physicians. So I would also like to thank all the physicians that I interviewed as part of this project, who were really generous in sharing their experiences with me, really amazing, interesting people, and also my spouse, Bill Walsh, who started me on this journey, as well as Dr. Anton Salud, who's a physician with whom I continue to collaborate on various aspects of this project. So my talk today is based on parts of my, oops, now I did it, hold on a second. Let's see, I think we can go there. There we go. Parts of my book, which was published by Indiana University Press last fall. And just for those of you, I presume a lot of people in the room know what folklore is, but just for those of you who don't, one way to start thinking about what folklore is to think about it as kind of informal culture. So if you kind of contrast it to culture with a capital C, such as art, art museums and libraries and museums and things like that, folklorists start thinking about folklorists as these sort of small, informal interactions that exist largely in face-to-face situations. So, stereotypically might be songs and jokes and sayings and stories and all these sorts of communications that we all participate in, but that also signal values and ideas about the world. And that's why we as folklorists are interested in studying them. And I got interested in this project because my spouse entered medical school at the same time that I was getting a PhD in folklore. And he had been around folklore and folklorists enough to recognize folklore when he saw it, and he started bringing home examples. And they were kind of interesting, but I didn't really know what to do with them. And then kind of over time, my interest grew. So what I focused on in this project was really the physician-to-physician interactions. There's been a lot of research done on physician-patient communication, but I really wasn't interested in physician-patient interactions. I was sort of interested in the backstage talk and what happened among physicians themselves. So the organization of the talk is I'm going to talk about the training and occupational culture a little bit, because if you don't come from a medical background, it's a little bit Byzantine. Then I'll talk about this notion of the Carnivalesque, and then the folklore of doctors, and then its relevance to this training and suffering, and wrap up with some of those conclusions. Okay. So the training and occupational culture. Now the reason is it's important context. So one of the most common phrases that you'll hear physicians talk about when they talk about their training is that it's quote unquote like drinking from a fire hose. And that is a proverbial expression that you'll find all the time. And what that means is it refers to literally like this torrential amount of information that you are supposed to digest when you're a student. And of course, the idea is that you can't actually digest any of it, so it's kind of an impossible task. And the first 2 years of medical school in general, speaking very broadly, are classes and labs and exams, and that's it. So gross anatomy, microbiology, pathology, genetics, those are the kinds of hard science classes that students will take. And their time is spent entirely by studying and taking exams and being in lab. And then the second 2 years in medical school are characterized by the clinical rotations, which are the hands-on experiential form of learning. So they will rotate for different periods of time through medical specialties, essentially to get tastes of what different kinds of medicine is out there. So they might spend a few weeks in family practice, maybe like a month doing psychiatry, maybe like 2 months in surgery. They kind of literally like rotate through these various areas to learn about them. And then they take histories, they research patient conditions, report to superiors, receive feedback, and then that helps them choose what specialty they want to do after medical school, how they want to specialize. And then, in order to get into a specialty, they go through what's called the match, and this is very famous because it's very stressful. And the next stage after medical school is called residency training, and that entails in-depth training of about 3 to 5 years, depending on what specialty you go into. And students will apply for their residency in their 4th year of medical school, and it's like applying for a job. So you apply to a lot of different places, you may or may not get an interview, and students will frequently apply to more than one specialty in order to secure a spot, because there's not actually enough residency spots for medical students. So this is a kind of a problem inherent in the system. So there's a lot of pressure to get a residency spot. And then where you go is actually determined by an algorithm, like all of our lives are. So that tells you where you, quote unquote, have matched. So you might get your first choice, maybe you really want to, go somewhere in New York because you want to be a surgeon there. Or you might get your last choice, or you might not get a spot at all. So nobody knows where they have matched until what's called, quote unquote, Black Friday. This is sort of a colloquial term for this date, which is literally the 3rd Friday in March. And this is the date that every medical student across the country finds out where they are going. So they all find out at the same time. And it is important to note that the match is binding. So once you match, you have to go. And I don't know of any other profession, unless you want to drop out. I mean, you could drop out. But I don't really know of any other profession where that process happens, where you sort of are determined by an algorithm. So despite this sort of, photograph that I have on the screen where it's like match date, there's really like a lot of pressure in that process. And it's definitely a kind of rite of passage for students. And kind of a little bit of doom to it in some ways. So there's sort of a ritualistic, like, where are the fates sending me, and I won't know until I find out. And then everybody, all medical students, all 4th year medical students who have matched will start their residency essentially on July 1st. And so part of the folklore of medicine is that if you are a layperson, do not get sick in July. Don't go to the hospital because all the residents are new. They were just medical students like a month ago, so they don't know anything. So word to the wise, do not get sick in July. Yeah. So then residency is, again, depends on what kind of branch you're going, but it can be 3 to 5 years. So you might do a residency in internal medicine, psychiatry, general surgery, but the work is very intense. I don't know why it's doing this. The work is very intense and very difficult. And the intern year, which is the first year in particular, is known for little status or authority. Interns do not set their own schedule and work holidays and weekends. And again, it's very difficult to generalize and to characterize a particular day, but you might think of your life as an intern. You might start your work anywhere from 4 in the morning to maybe 7. And most interns work some kind of call schedule, and this is just sort of the rotation that you come into work. And so what I have up here is an example of what's called a Q2 call schedule, and this is one of the more rigorous ones. So this would be an example of a surgical call schedule, and I got this one from a surgeon I interviewed. And this would be, you come in Monday morning, you work all day Monday, you work all Monday night, then you work all day Tuesday. And then you might go home Tuesday afternoon or evening, kind of depending what's going on, but maybe 6, maybe 7, could be 10. And then you come in Wednesday morning, and then about 4 o'clock in the morning, and you start all over again. And you do that for maybe a year, something like that. And I would say when you're working those nights, you oftentimes are not sleeping. So we're literally talking about 36 hours or something like that. You might catch 20 minutes of sleep if it's quiet. Now, prior to 2003, there were no limits on how many hours residents could work, and these are called resident duty hours. And that has changed since then. They have reduced that work schedule to a maximum of 80 hours a week. But according to many of the people I did interviews with, that wasn't actually true in practice. It was sort of, in there in theory, and then maybe you held to 80 hours, but maybe you just sort of just kept working. And then, of course, after residency, a lot of physicians, not all of them, might go on to a fellowship. So if you, in order to acquire additional training, so for example, if you wanted to be a hand surgeon, you might do an orthopedic residency and then do a hand fellowship for 1 or 2 years in order to be able to operate on the hand. So the takeaway, the takeaway from all this context is that this is a very long and intense period of training during which physicians are socialized to work as hard as possible, to be very tough, to be very self-reliant. And during this training, they fully internalize their identity as a physician because they have no other identity. There is, literally it's very difficult to be a friend, be a spouse, maintain family, have a social life because the training is so intense. And it's during medical school and residencies that a lot of this folklore emerges. Okay, so then what, I don't know why my computer keeps doing this. So what is the Carnivalesque? So this is how I kind of characterized this body of folklore that emerges. This is a literary term coined by the Russian scholar Mikhail Bakhtin. And what he does is he does a very close reading of an early modern author named Francois Rabelais, and he characterizes Rabelais' writings as Carnivalesque. And Rabelais' writings, they're comic, they're very wordy, but they're essentially stories about giants. And you can kind of see this picture of the giant in the woodcut there. And as giants, they have non-normative bodies that are very large and very strong. And they engage in behaviors that are sort of bawdy and violent. Lots of people get killed, they're gluttonous, they're very earthy, they cause a lot of chaos. And their over-the-top behavior is accompanied by a lot of laughter and hilarity, including scenes of violence and death. So there's sort of comic beatings, ridiculous amounts of carnage during battles, things like that. And according to Bakhtin, this Russian scholar, Rabelais did not invent this style. It came across in his writings, but he was instead drawing on a long folk tradition. He characterizes it a folk tradition of sort of laughter and travesty and parody that he calls the Carnivalesque. And this tradition is essentially a symbolic system that is largely based on the body. So it includes a lot of cursing, feasting, drinking, excessiveness, again, parody. And the body is used to essentially mock power and authority. So it makes the ordinary absurd and serves often to kind of degrade sacred values and institutions. And so this imagery that he talks about draws particularly on the lower half of the body, so the belly and the digestive systems and the genitals, and is a very kind of earthy form of communication. So you can kind of see in some ways why giants would make good incarnations of it. And there's also a lot of imagery of death and dismemberment of the body. So the body is rent apart and put back together in different kinds of ways. So one of the times and places this sort of behavior in speech emerges is medieval carnival. And that's where that term comes from, the Carnivalesque. And medieval society was very structured and hierarchical. But during Carnival, temporary period of time, social restrictions were loosened, and structures and hierarchies were loosened for a short period of time. So you didn't always have to follow the ordinary rules, and there were fewer repercussions for transgressive behavior. So there's a very specific relationship between the society of medieval society and Carnival, in which these very rigid structures are overturned. And if you look at this painting, a lot of you probably are familiar with this painting. This is a painting by Peter Bruegel the Elder entitled The Conflict Between Carnival and Lent. And I don't know if you can see it there, but right in the front, you kind of have Lent, which is a time of fasting and religiosity and prayer, represented by, she's holding sort of a peel with some fish on it, religious figure, and then over here you have the carnival figure, which is, he has a big belly, there's meat on the end of his sword, and they're sort of facing off, you know, who's gonna win. So one aspect that happened during this time was that the masses during Carnival would critique powerful institutions such as the church and the monarchy. And again, this happened through jokes and laughter and symbolic inversion, and that is a time when people of low status are given high status, and people of high status are sort of made low. So those of you who have seen maybe Walt Disney's The Hunchback of Notre Dame, there's that figure where the hunchback is sort of made king for the day. He's done, I think it's the Feast of Fools, which is a carnival-like festival, and he's sort of made king. So he's a person of low status that is kind of given temporarily status for a day, and accompanied by a lot of laughter. So on the one hand, Bakhtin characterizes these behaviors as positive, because he saw them as sort of an opening up of society in which those sort of formal rules and structures were loosened, and as kind of a generative force. But he also does emphasize that this is fundamentally ambivalent behavior because it's fairly transgressive. There's a lot of death. In his characterization, one way that one gets to new life is through death, for example. And of course, anything that questions authority is calling into question the order of the world. It's sort of a fundamentally ambivalent act. And scholars today generally theorize this as reinforcing dominant structures. So there is mockery, there's kind of a temporary chaos, but ultimately it sort of reinforces the status quo and everything goes back to normal. So when I talk about the carnivalesque aspects that I think are inherent in medical folklore, I do acknowledge that this is a reinforcement of these ideas, and this is a temporary mockery, but they do sort of reinforce these hierarchies that they target. Now, interestingly, Rabelais, so this is the early modern author, he was a physician and an anatomist, and this was really interesting to me when I found this out. And so his writings, these early modern writings, are filled with a lot of medical references, including references to disease, to exaggerated forms of the body, and those medical references seep into Bakhtin's characterizations of the carnivalesque. And what I have found striking in this research is that, 400 years after Rabelais wrote, we actually still find some of this imagery around in some of the folklore and the humor of modern physicians. So I've divided this body of folklore into three. I keep trying to connect to something. I'm not sure what's going on. To three different themes. One kind of touching on the interconnection of death and life, the second, the body, and the third having to do with the mocking of knowledge or truth. And in the interest of time, I'm just going to talk about two of them, which is this association of death and life, and then the mocking of power and authority, but I'll talk about the body a little bit. Okay. So it would not be surprising that death would be a theme in medical folklore, and one might say that physicians spend their entire careers haunted by the specter of death. Death-related topics and references emerge in proverbial sayings and jokes and euphemisms and esoteric references and slang, But what a lot of them really target is this institutionalized and highly bureaucratic response to death, is what I found. So you can see in the picture, it says, you know, the monitors all show that you're dead, but to be sure, we'll have to run some kind of test. So it's not really mocking death, it's really mocking sort of this bureaucratic, institutionalized response to death. And the place I want to talk to you today is about gross anatomy, which is a class that students take the first year of medical school, and where in groups they dissect an entire cadaver over the course of a semester or maybe a year. So students spend a lot of time with the body, and they come to know it quite intimately. So some context, obviously dissection up until the modern era was a fairly taboo act that had to be highly, I mean, it's still highly regulated, obviously. But if you think about it in any other context, apart from this academic context, what students do in gross anatomy is a highly transgressive and taboo act. And you know, they would be considered insane and arrested if they did that outside of medical school. So it really was not until the 20th century that dissection came to be rationalized and medicalized. And by the term rationalized, I mean to make more efficient and to control outcomes through technocratic decisions and practices. The donors, the body donors, are also anonymized. So students know nothing about the donor usually, except what they can determine from the body itself, such as if the person died of cancer. And it's this context of anonymization and rationalization that allows the dissection to occur in an appropriate way. The official stance regarding dissection emphasizes respect for the body donor. So students are told over and over again that respect is of utmost importance. In interviews that I did with medical students, students understand and repeated that the donor had given a great gift. There was no equivocation on that. But gross anatomy also exists, apart from this interesting history of dissection, in a modern cultural context that avoids death, and in which people very rarely see dead bodies. Cultural critic Samuel Lawrence and historian Philippe Arié both agree that one word to describe Western attitudes towards death in the 20th century is denial. So medicine played also a large role in this modern denial of death, seeking to control and rationalize death by, for example, moving people who are dying and sick into hospitals and out of kind of the public view. So gross anatomy may be the first time that students have encountered a dead body or even death at all. So one of the most common examples of folklore in gross anatomy is nicknaming the donor. And this tradition dates at least to the 19th century, and according to one 2013 study, it's estimated that perhaps 68% of medical students might name their body donor. Now, some names can be straightforward, such as Joe, because the donor seemed like an average Joe. Frank or Edna or Agnes or Herman were perceived as quote-unquote old people's names, and named maybe because they look like a Frank or an Agnes or a Herman. Sometimes the nicknames are puns or plays on words, and this is pretty frequent. As one medical student told NPR's Melissa Block, they were going to name their donor Reggie Mortis, if it was male, and Regina Mortis, if it was female. Another student named their donor Ernest, as in, I'm working in dead earnest. So. Other examples were names based on physical characteristics. Frank the Tank was a person who was sort of physically large. Melanie, named for the fact that the person had moles and presumably died of melanoma or something like that. A second kind of folklore that emerges during gross anatomy are legends about pranks or other inappropriate things done with the body. Legends are stories about extraordinary events purported to be true, although not necessarily. Often fictional, they straddle the boundaries between fiction and nonfiction, between truth and lies. As such, they are inherently interesting stories because they force their audience to ask, could this extraordinary event possibly be true? And that's why we're interested in them. So one example of this kind of story I heard during my fieldwork was that the medical school used to assign bone boxes to students, meaning that they had a skeleton in the box, and the students were allowed to take these bone boxes home to study them. This happened in New Orleans, allegedly. One student took the bone box home and left it on the trolley. Someone found it, freaked out, and of course it caused quite a bit of ruckus for the police, and after that the bone boxes had to stay in the facility. Another common legend was about students who might have taken a dissected hand or fingers and hid them in the elevator door to pretend that the fingers or hands had been severed in order to prank an unwitting victim. Steve's laughing. So there are lots of stories, again, largely apocryphal, about inappropriate things done with the body donors. So one reading of this, for example, the nicknaming tradition, is that it is straight outright disrespectful, and this is officially the view of medical schools and medical school authorities. I believe, however, this is too narrow a perspective. Medical students are engaging in an act that has only been sanctionalized through these bureaucratized and rationalized processes. Giving a donor a nickname pushes back against such instrumentalization. A nickname imputes human characteristics, and thus humanity, to the donor, acknowledging that the body undergoing dissection was once a real human being and not merely or only an anonymized medical lab specimen. It is a response that acknowledges life in the midst of death and couples it with a little bit of levity. Regarding the legend examples, I think these stories function similarly in that they narratively violate official stances that advocate donor anonymity, respect, and proper care of bodies. Contemporary legends take an idea or a value and exaggerate it to the point of near impossibility, making that idea more concrete and visible. So legends in which bodies are taken out of the lab and played with therefore invert these core values, subverting what folklorist Catherine Young calls the, quote, aristocratic discourse of medicine. Additionally, anthropologist Mary Douglas argues that jokes are symbolic representations of ruptures in social patterns, and legends and jokes are really closely related. The rupture in the social pattern is the act of dissection itself as a taboo act or as an historically taboo act. Students who do things in legends are merely making something bigger and more melodramatic, mediating in stories what is actually happening in the lab. Such stories explore serious questions of where is the line, what boundaries are acceptable to cross and which are not. Finally, I would add that dissection itself is a carnivalesque act. The body is dismembered in all kinds of festival forms in these early modern writings, and Bakhtin notes that anatomization is often associated with images of feasting and banquetry, so this is in these comic writings. A description of a beating in which eyes and ears and bones are turned to pulps, he writes, quote, we see once more the anatomizing dismemberment and the culinary and medical terms that accompany it. And there were, I don't have time to go through these examples, but there were examples of sort of students connecting bodies with food in certain kinds of ways. Further, public dissections in Italy were literally conducted during Carnival, so there was an overt association between the two. So this entire class in some ways can be read within this Carnivalesque tradition. And I'll share here this photo that's on the cover of the book. This is a photo from 1910, and I believe it comes from Case Western, where there is an actual joke played with the body, and this is a picture of a medical student. The title of the photograph is A Medical Student's Dream, and the medical student is on the gurney about to be dissected by the skeleton and the body donors around them, and they've positioned the body donors as, going to do the dissection and as the doctors. And it's a really nice example of that kind of symbolic inversion that I was talking about earlier, and sort of this conjoining of death and life. So I really like that picture in which the cadavers have the one up on the medical students. Okay, let me just check my time. I think we're okay. Okay, the grotesque body. So this is the idea of the body that comes up in medical folklore. And when I use the term grotesque, I don't mean in the term gross, like in the modern sense, but it's earthy, and it's very expansive and large. And again, it's sort of a focus on the lower half of the body. And it's a transgressive body that helps ideally generate new meaning. This is a picture from a grotesque in Glinton Church in the UK. I think it's fairly famous. And the story associated about it with this grotesque is that it was made so its buttocks were pointed in a direct line towards the Peterborough Cathedral. So it's literally mocking this other cathedral that's over there. So you can see how the lower half of the body is used for mockery in this imagery, particularly for something that is considered to be valued or sacred, such as this church that's apparently across the way. And it doesn't always have to be done physically. It can be done in speech. It doesn't have to be the physical body. So this imagery is complex, but again, it's not surprising in the practice of medicine that humor about the body emerges. And one thing I noticed was physicians will tell a lot of stories about the body where the body does just kind of very surprising or amazing things. You just wouldn't expect it to do that. So sort of stories about bizarre physical events. And one of the stories that got me thinking about this was a story I heard for years from my father-in-law, who's an orthopedic physician. And he tells the story, and I think it's apocryphal, but it's about a story about a body doing kind of amazing things. And he talks about when he was an intern and somebody came in, and this was around New Year's Eve, and walked into the ER complaining of a splitting headache. And they're like, well, there's a champagne glass sticking out of your head. And the story is that he had been walking along, it was New Year's Eve, somebody had had a party, they dropped a champagne glass from the top of one of the apartment buildings, and somehow the base had shattered and the stem had ended up, in his skull. Now, I don't know whether that's true or not, it's probably not, but that's the kind of story that, that I'm talking about. There's also a lot of scatological references and jokes, and I would refer here the audience to the excellent article by the AFC's Stephen Winnick, who really was very influential in this work, where he explored metaphors of filth in reference to medical speech. And I would add that Dr. Winnick is not the only person to explore that. So, it is definitely a theme that exists. And what I talk about in the section of the book is this has to do with pollutants, essentially. So providers are constantly dealing with bodily fluids and at risk of being sort of symbolically, not just actually, but in the symbolic world, sort of symbolically contaminated and degraded, and these are strongly associated with images of the grotesque body. So I do have one slide that talks about this, kind of a quick joke, which is a visual reference that connects this idea of eating and drinking with pollution, and this is a picture, of apple juice in a urine beaker. And the idea is that you might actually mix the two up and end up drinking urine, which would be a very Carnivalesque idea. But again, getting back to these like early modern and medieval references, there's a lot of material in the medieval period that mock physicians for being interested in urine. So there's a book of hours that I reference in my book, where there's these marginalia images of animals impersonating physicians and being really interested in the urine of their patients and stuff, and it's sort of a way to poke fun of physicians. So the way I theorize this in the book is that this grotesque body stands in direct contrast to an idealized, controlled, and medicalized body. The medicalized and controlled body is the normative one that physicians are trying to achieve through medical intervention, but it is this sort of uncontrolled, grotesque, expansive one that they actually encounter in their work. So there's a very strong disciplining aspect to this material, a very much reinforcement of that status quo, but it is at least a way that the folklore itself is sort of mediating these two dimensions. Okay, I'm gonna skip that little thing. Okay. So the third theme is the idea of the contingent nature of truth and authority. And by that phrase, what I mean is that truth, authority, and power are not eternal, but rather provisional. And here we find a whole body of folklore that recasts expert knowledge, physician expert knowledge, as spurious or absurd or quackery, and in doing so sort of temporarily contests medical authority and presuppositions of power. And again, medicine in a lot of ways is pretty hierarchical and rigid. There's sort of an overturning that happens there. I've already talked about how physician training and knowledge acquisition is very technical and specialized, and that each specialty sort of represents the pinnacle of expertise in that particular branch of medicine. So there is a lot of folklore that emerges among physicians that's kind of based in stereotypes about different specialties, and that target specialties by transforming that area of expertise into nonsense. So through caricature, satire, and play, knowledge is reframed as funny, nonsensical, or lacking in practicality, while doctors themselves are portrayed as idle, greedy, or foolish. And I should note that some of these jokes can be a little esoteric, so they can be hard to understand if you are not a medical insider. But I will start with this absurdist flowchart. And there are lots of variations of this that, quote unquote, help medical students decide what specialty they should choose vis-a-vis a series of questions. So in this one, which medical specialty is right for you? It starts with, are you a people person? And from there you can choose whether or not you mind being vomited on, whether or not you have a positive or negative response to rashes and feet, and if you're yes, you go into dermatology, and whether or not you're secretly a vampire, which puts you into radiology and pathology. And I would say that vampirism is associated with a number of specialties, including surgeons, anesthesiologists, radiology, and pathology. And the association seems largely to be based on lack of sleep, a preference for working in dark rooms, and an interest in bodily fluids. Of all the specialties, orthopedics seems the most maligned. Orthopedic surgeons colloquially are known as orthopods, and in jokes they are targeted as being dumb. This is of course untrue, but as noted joke scholar Christy Davies points out, stupidity jokes targeting specific groups are common worldwide. And as the medical field values intelligence, it is not surprising that some fields are caricatured as lacking in book smarts. So you can see how those jokes sort of mock and reinforce at the same time. Davies argues that groups that work with material objects often become the butt of stupidity jokes. And he uses orthopedic surgeons as an example because he states bones are the most material aspect of the body. He provides a joke to him told by an Israeli physician in Hungary in 2007. And the joke is, let's see, where did I put the joke? Well, what do you call a double-blind study? That's the question, and the answer is two orthopedic surgeons looking at an electrocardiogram, and the idea is that they can't read it. And Davis concludes that for the jokers, brainy surgeons work on brains, and the boneheaded work on bones. So, but you can see this continues in all other, lots of different other kinds of jokes. So this is a very common joke cycle. How do you hide $1 from an orthopedist? You guys can guess this. Put it in the book, right? Did you hear the tragedy of the orthopedic department's library? There was a fire and it burned their one book. And this one is a little more esoteric. How does an orthopedist save the elevator door? Uses their head. And this is the idea that, if you're running for the elevator door, which part of the body don't you need that you're going to use to save the elevator? So if they don't do their head. The first cycle, there's a whole list of different specialties that you can insert there. And of course, it's based on these stereotypes about specialties. But it also sort of targets this idea that doctors are maybe greedy or too interested in money. So there's sort of a different kind of critique going on there. And then, like I said, the last one is different specialties use different parts of their body. In addition to being caricatured as dumb, orthopedists are also stereotyped as being strong. A certain amount of strength is required for some orthopedic surgeries, like hip surgery, and they also cover sports-related injuries and sports medicine. This, combined with ideas about strength and lack of brains, means that orthopedics are the jocks of the medical world, and they suffer from the same image problems that jocks endure in society at large, a perception of a lack of intelligence and a reliance on brute strength to get the job done. And I would say that there's a British medical journal that actually published sort of a satirical article, and the title of that article was Orthopedic Surgeons, this was written by orthopedists, Orthopedic Surgeons as strong as an ox and almost twice as clever. And it was, you know. Other specialties are also maligned. Psychiatry is characterized, unsurprisingly, as being full of crazy people. And anesthesia is characterized as being somewhat lazy or idle. And this is due to the nature of the work. Once the patient is, asleep, anesthesiologists maintain the patient's state of paralysis largely through auditory monitoring, so they're listening to the screens, and that's their mode of attending to patients. But because their mode of you can kind of read the paper and maybe listen for the beeps, other people in the room are like, what are they doing? And I think I've got time to play this little video, so let me just escape. Hopefully this will work for you. One of my favorite examples of this, one of the things that some physicians will also do, there's all kinds of YouTube videos and all kinds of social media where they're singing about their work. So there's definitely like some doctors are performers. And this was a group, a British singing group that was popular in the 2000s. They were anesthesiologists. And they called this one the Anesthetist Hymn. And this was an early song that kind of got me on this track as well. So hopefully this works.
Everybody wonders what anaesthetists do while the patient is asleep. Everybody wonders what we do for 3 hours while that machine goes beep. Everybody reckons we drink coffee and we gossip and we're generally subversive. Everybody reckons we do crosswords and Sudoku and we chat up all the nurses. But do you really think that's all we do? Well, let me tell you now, it isn't true. 'Cause we sometimes check the screen, and every now and then we write stuff, and if we have to intervene, we inject a bit of white stuff, and we offer to alter the light, or the height of the bed, or fiddle with the radio, change the CD. We even check the patient occasionally. And if they move, we turn up the vapor, and then we go back to reading the paper. But when the patient's asleep, we just sit and listen to the beep. We just sit and listen to the once upon a time I took pride in my job, but now I think it's time to depart. 'Cause I just sit here every day and listen to blips of the heart.
I'm going to skip because I'm running a little bit out of time, but I just want to say that this idea of anesthesia and sort of being idle, there's also like there's a hashtag called Blame Anesthesia. That's very popular in the social media. Like Blame Anesthesia even has its own Facebook group, and the idea is that somebody needs to be blamed for something, so we're just going to blame anesthesia. So that's another way in which anesthesia gets blamed. So I'm going to move on to where does all this get at? Because I'd like to leave time for questions. So I'll sort of skip this idea of there's a long tradition of sort of questioning medical competence and like this humor about medical competence. But I want to know what else is going on here. And Bakhtin stated that the Carnivalesque exists to hold terror at bay. Like that's what he said was one of the functions. And he meant the terror of the natural world. And the idea was that this sort of bawdiness and terror and hilarity turned terror into something else. And what I propose in medical context is that what is transformed is not terror, but suffering. And then I delve quite a bit into the nature of suffering in medical practice, so I'll talk a little bit about what that looks like and wrap up. The vast majority of the discussion about suffering in medicine focuses on the suffering of patients. And that is appropriate. Patients suffer. Patient suffering is also obviously the focus of physicians and their work, and patient suffering broadly conceived is the focus of most medical research. So this is a clinical, instrumental approach to the issue of suffering. It is a problem in patients to be solved, or at least alleviated. But what I found in my fieldwork was that suffering extends beyond patients, and it is embedded in the nature of doctoring and touches all care providers. I focused on doctors. But this really isn't recognized in the literature at all. And in stating that physicians suffer, I do not want to say that they don't enjoy their work or that they don't find it rewarding, but I don't think that they're mutually exclusive. But this is what it looks like. First, physicians are witnesses to suffering. They see a lot of suffering in their work, some specialties more than others. But I'll just give you a quote from one physician I interviewed. Quote, "The nature of what we do is that you're entering into suffering. And in some cases, what they're suffering, meaning the patients, is horrible, whether it's parents where a child has been diagnosed with cancer, or a premature baby that's born that has a life-threatening anomaly, or a healthy kid that's involved in a trauma that's life-threatening. I mean, it's horrible suffering that you're recognizing in the world." Second, research has shown that being a witness to suffering can cause suffering in the witness, and that's simply true. Ongoing exposure to trauma is a criterion for PTSD in the DSM-5, which is the most current diagnostic manual. And third, doctors are tasked with healing patients and relieving their suffering, or at least the very least trying to do something to stave off sickness, disease, and death for a period of time. That is their job. So sickness, suffering, and death are fully embedded in the duties of doctoring, and they are responsible for this, and this sense of responsibility is pounded into them during their training. It is a core aspect of their identity. Sometimes those cases of suffering are extreme. In my book, I talk about a couple of them, but one is the example of mass shootings. During such times of national tragedy, the focus is on the victims, rightly so, or perhaps on issues of gun control. It is not usually, however, on the physicians or other first responders who care for the victims, see the carnage, make very difficult life and death decisions, and are tasked with putting torn bodies back together. COVID-19 was another example. This suffering is inherent in the work, is compounded by the organizational culture. There is no time to process any kind of emotional or psychological stress, and they are unable to take the time to heal. Indeed, doctors are discouraged at all from taking time off or attending to their own needs, including sickness. And there are many reasons for this. One is that it creates work for your colleagues. If a physician takes time off, it is usually at the expense of one's coworkers. I'm talking about hospital situations. Sick patients don't go away, and one's coworkers will have to care for the sick in addition to their own if a physician takes time off. So they learn to ignore or downplay their own illness, and this is highly reinforced through that training period. Many times, you might not even be sick, you might not have time to eat or go to the bathroom. And obviously, we've touched on the issues of sleep. And there is even less tolerance for mental health issues. Physicians who do prioritize their own needs are seen as weak, and they use very masculine discourses of being weak and strong. So it's an occupational culture that prioritizes patient needs and patient suffering and encourages stoicism, endurance, and indifference to one's own needs and well-being. Further, what happens when you're responsible for sickness, for staving off sickness, suffering, death, and things don't work out? What happens when a patient dies anyway, a mistake is made, or there is a pandemic? For doctors who have been trained to be highly competent, who have fully internalized their occupational identity, and who feel responsible for their patients, this can lead to feelings of shame, powerlessness, a threat to your identity, meaningless and isolation, all of which, according to ethicist Eric Cassell, are components of suffering. The result is that physicians have some of the highest suicide rates of any profession, high burnout rates, unresolved PTSD, trauma, addiction issues that are basically not addressed. So for interest of time, I'll just wrap up and say the main takeaway is that suffering is embedded in the practice of medicine in ways that go well beyond patient suffering, and I argue in the book that suffering is actually a cultural feature of medicine and not just a clinical one, and that is the deep context for this Medical Carnivalesque. And what this Carnivalesque does, the comic in general is a world without suffering. I mean, that is kind of a basic definition of the comic. So a comic world can entail beatings, it can entail dismemberment and even death, and the image I always think of are those slapstick clowns that fall down and they're funny, you know, but they're funny because the clown does not feel pain. The medical Carnivalesque reflects the realities of medicine, but it transforms dominant frameworks that construct physicians as heroic and all-knowing to ones that frame them as quacks, from ones that emphasize the sacredness of the patient body to ones that frame it as a comic monster, and from frameworks that emphasize the work of doctors as gods to ones that posit them as fools who traffic in urine and feces for the love of money. It transforms the seriousness, pain, and suffering of the medical workaday world into a ludic one. And while it does ultimately reaffirm these institutions, until the culture of medicine itself changes, it remains a useful tool that draws on quite potent and sometimes ancient imagery. So, thank you. Okay, well, I am happy to take questions.
We have time for a few questions. If you'd raise your hand if you have a question, and we'll come by with a mic. So we'll have you on tape. Okay, gentlemen.
I can, here you go.
I really enjoyed your presentation, and I'm glad you brought up how intense the training is, and also the fact that we tend not to take care of ourselves when we're going through the training period. And we were also discouraged from getting sick, even if we were sick, and we dare not show up because, as you had mentioned, it really creates an extra burden for our colleagues, and you didn't want to do that. So there was a kind of a culture where you don't get sick, you show up, and even if you were sick, and that was something new to me. The other point that you made about orthopedic doctors is I'm not an orthopod, and I was a medical oncologist. We sort of looked down upon the orthopods because we wondered whether or not they really needed to go to medical school, because anytime any medical issue arose with their patients, they'd call internal medicine, they'd call for help. And so we thought basically orthopods were glorified carpenters. And do they really need to go to medical school? So anyway, that's... You made some excellent points. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Also, let me just, before the next question, let me remind people that there are copies of Dr. Gabbert's book for sale at the back, and she will be signing them later if anybody wants to take home and read more about this great topic. Let's...
Hi, thank you so much for being here today. This is a super interesting talk. I kind of wanted, my father's a physician, which is why I'm here today, and I kind of had a question about the theme of exaggeration in the Carnivalesque, because one of the things that was very characteristic of my dad's medical knowledge in the home was an exaggerated response to things that weren't serious. So like, in his practice, in his work, he's very serious. You take your patient's problems seriously and you treat them with respect. But you come home and your kid stubs her toe, you say, well, obviously the solution to this is to amputate it. Let's go out to the garage, I've got the hacksaw. So I'm curious about that sort of, like the way this folklore transcends the medical society and touches on other aspects of physicians' lives in that term of exaggeration.
That's an interesting question. I'd have to think about that a little bit. Well, I mean, he's joking, obviously. He wouldn't actually recommend it. But yeah. Well, the reality is that the folklore isn't contained in just, an occupational culture. It does seep out. And sometimes, even in like medieval carnival, getting back to that idea of the things that would happen there. Sometimes, it would seep out into real life too. Like the boundaries between sort of that framework and ordinary life are porous. And so I think what you're talking about is the same thing. There's a little bit of, you can't compartmentalize quite that much. There's some, and I think, you know, a lot of the analyses of this kind of humor in folklore have been fairly functional. So, you know, that provides a sense of relief. Sometimes it's been interpreted as hostility against patients, or as, you know, kind of just psychic energy release almost. And I think that a lot of those are true. I do think that those interpretations generally hold water. I just feel like because this carnivalesque framework is based in the body, and it really is quite connected in some ways to medical references. That's why I characterize it like that. But that sounds like what it's happening with your dad. You know, as a way to continue that framework in domestic spaces, maybe. So it's not just physician to physician; it's also with their families, and that's how I got interested in it. You know, as my husband went through medical school, and I was like, there's some interesting things happening that are going on.
Two quick questions. One, you don't have to answer if you don't want to, but we're curious what kind of physician your husband is.
Oh, interesting.
And secondly, we're lots of medical people in the family. And my second question is if your book talks at all about some of the humor stuff and what non-medical people might consider to be kind of sick humor. If you talk about that all as being a way of coping.
Yeah, good question. Well, for the first, he did pulmonary critical care originally is what he did his fellowship in, and now he does addiction. So he changed courses, was his career trajectory. Again, I am certainly not the first person to study this stuff at all, and it has been sometimes characterized even in the scholarly literature as dark humor or black humor, but I sort of talk about that in the introduction. But again, I think this framework of the carnivalesque, it's not all black humor. I mean, like the jokes about the orthopedist, that's not really black humor. It's just sort of this kind of anti-establishment stuff, you know, that comes up because I think medicine is so institutionalized. Like it's a very and it's a very powerful discourse in modern society. So that's why I like that framework. But yes, I do think that transformation of suffering is a way of coping in certain kinds of ways. But the suffering that physicians go through, because it sounds kind of bad in some ways to talk about physician suffering. And the physicians I interviewed talked about this. You know, like they said, it's hard to talk about being sick when you clearly, if you have somebody dying in front of you, your own cold is really not that important, you know, and that's true. But if you internalize that over very long periods of time, you really, we have a culture, an occupational culture in which, and I think things are changing. I don't think this is a static thing either, but we have an occupational culture in which the providers don't know how to take care of themselves, literally. And so I think what this levity does is sort of, at a symbolic level, transforms the suffer in the same way that this author Bakhtin talked about in earlier periods. It transformed terror of the natural world. Well, maybe we're not terrified of the natural world anymore, but we're still in pain, at least in this occupation. And it's oftentimes really not acknowledged. Like there's definitely, it encourages kind of a silencing of physician needs. And so what I think really needs to happen is it really needs, ideally, be very difficult, but it needs to happen as an entire reorientation of medical culture to acknowledge the physician as part of that healing process rather than only a focus on the patient. And I don't want to say like I think we should focus on patients, but it should be a more holistic perspective, if that makes sense.
One more question, perhaps?
Thanks. Wonderful presentation. I love the framing of it as carnivalesque. You mentioned my paper, and mine was on a much more narrow topic, but carnivalesque, you know, encompasses a lot more. And it kind of brings me to my question. These are some folklore items that I didn't deal with in my work on this because they didn't fit the specific thing that I was talking about. But the question I have is whether you have noted change over time in some of these traditions, because some of your traditions are very long-standing. You mentioned naming of the body, and my father's cadaver was Ernest back in the early 1950s. So that's one name that stayed. But I've also noted in my research change among certain things, and you noted that I was laughing when you talked about the fingers in the elevator door.
Did you?
And it's because my father's story about that, and this was back when the toll on the George Washington Bridge was $1, and you had to actually hand the money to a person who would reach out. They would wedge a silver dollar between the fingers of the cadaver, and they would leave the cadaver with the toll booth person, right? That was the apocryphal story, of course. We're sure it never happened, but that's what they said happened. And then another one and so that, of course, wouldn't work anymore because that's not how toll booths work. And so this elevator story may have emerged to replace that story. And another one that changed over time, that there were a lot of mnemonic devices that had carnivalesque aspects. So one of them was to characterize the nerves in your head as either sensory or motor or both. So each one was an S, an M, or a B. And in my father's day, it was, some say Marilyn Monroe, but my brother says Brigitte Bardot.
Oh, yeah.
When my brother was in medical school, that was, some say marry money, but my brother says big boobs matter more. And this amused me because I was the brother who purportedly said that, but though I never did. But so those are things that changed over time in relation to both social structures and physical circumstances of the world. And I wonder if you noted changes in some of this folklore over time.
Yeah, well, the mnemonics one is a good one. Since we're being filmed, I might not say it, but there is one that is like LGBTQ friendly. We'll just say that Oliver might not be interested in girls anymore. So, so yeah, that's definitely an example, and it was a mnemonic that got updated as that became more prevalent. So definitely it changes over time, and I think some of those harsher ways of talking about patients has changed for sure. I think people are much more careful about the way they talk about patients in some kinds of ways. I think there are still stories about bodies and the weird things that bodies do. And there are, in some cases, perhaps not the best way of talking about patients, but what I talk about in the book is, in some ways, it's really a normative body versus a kind of a non-normative body, and not about an individual as often. I think it's about sort of strange things that bodies can do or are.
Would you all please join me in thanking Dr. Gabbert for a terrific lecture? That was really good.